Hello and welcome. My name is Roni Firon, and this is The Bigger Picture, where we sit down with experts to hear about their journeys, their insights, and the big ideas that drive them. Stay tuned for today's episode. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Yulia Golland, a social neuroscientist who studies interpersonal synchrony. In other words, she studies how people get in sync with one another. Human beings are inherently social creatures. We are constantly shaping and being shaped by our social environments. A lot of this communication happens verbally, but the majority of it happens below our conscious radar, on levels that we may not be aware of. When we interact with someone else, sometimes we can have the feeling that we're clicking or that we're on the same wavelength, so to speak. What these metaphors help us describe is that feeling when we feel a sense of rapport and connectedness with the other person. We've all had these experiences, but what Yulia does is show that not only do we experience these moments of connectedness subjectively, but she also shows that objectively there are neurological and physiological markers that also become synchronized during such interactions. So to a certain extent, the saying that you and I are on the same wavelength is much more literal than we would have thought. It was really fun speaking with Yulia about the different ways in which this propensity to synchronize with others affects us, and we really got into the good, the bad, and the ugly of interpersonal synchrony. We spoke about the social nature of humans and how there is no individual without a community around him. The interplay between the individual and the collective is eternal, and the boundaries between self and the other are never quite clear. In a sense, we're immersed in a social network, and that network is a part of who we are, and we define ourselves based on the social context we're in. This social nature means that we have evolved to be so sensitive and receptive to the social cues around us that we do this subconsciously and automatically. I personally love research that takes phenomena that might be otherwise disregarded and grounds it in a secure scientific base of research. That's exactly what Yulia is doing. So, stay tuned and enjoy today's episode. On interpersonal synchrony, it means to be on the same wavelength. Start with a bit of an origin story. So, can you tell us how you came to study neuroscience and specifically interpersonal synchrony? And did you always know that this is the field that you wanted to research?
In me, I am sure it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Looking forward. About my personal history, I'll really try to make this very, very long story short because it's a long story. So I first wanted to be a psychologist. So I started at the psychology department in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My major was psychology, but I also majored in philosophy, and I must say I enjoyed philosophy much more than psychology. And it became very fast obvious to me that clinical psychology is not for me. Just didn't feel the connection to all the Freudian models and the unconsciousness. Although today, this is actually what I do and study the unconsciousness, but in a very different form than what we studied at the first year introduction to psychology. But I became fascinated with the brain and physiological processes, and started to volunteer at a wonderful lab with Professor Shlomo Bentin, who became my supervisor afterwards. And I could really appreciate that the brain study and the physiological studies allow me kind of to peek behind the curtain, because it fascinated me. And the question arrived from philosophy, actually. How does it work? How does the world really look like behind the veil of my eyes, my sensory system, my perceptual system? And the brain science, the physiology, allowed an illusion, because it is an illusion, that we touch there on real stuff, right? The stuff that is behind what we perceive, what we consciously perceive. It is an illusion because, of course, even when we do brain science, we do it with our consciousness. So it is still within the boundaries of the perceived reality.
So do you think that consciousness itself is an illusion, or how do you see
No.
where does the illusion come into the picture for
So
you?
the illusion is to think or to feel or to experience or to hope that when you study brain, you study the real stuff, the objective stuff. And when you study behavior, for example, or self-reports, or when you talk to people, you study more subjective fluid phenomena after it's been processed by our conscious sensors. Because even when we study brain, we do it first. We do it with all kinds of methodologies that we invented, and we never just study the brain. We always do it hypothesis-driven, and with the hypothesis comes all our biases and the limits of conscious experience.
So we're very much on the same page in that case.
Yeah?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think neuroscience has so much to teach us, but at the end of the day, I have a hard time reducing all of consciousness to only the physical. I think it can shed a lot of light, but but we need to understand that it's another methodology, and it does help us look under the hood.
Yeah, and I must say that I think that brain science had a tremendous contribution to understanding the nature of our consciousness, especially today with all the new brain models. It's just mind-blowing how we understand the mind better than before, at least in my view.
No, absolutely. And also confirm a lot of theories, right? Once you have also the physical realm proving certain theories that we have, these two worlds really speak with each other, and it's a lot more nuanced.
Yeah,
but I very much am for the integration of the two. So
okay, back
back
to Hebrew University. The year is 2001 or something like that. I don't remember exactly. So I joined Professor Shlomo Bentin's lab. And what we did there is studying the physiology of face perception. So, people are really experts in perceiving faces of others and recognizing faces. We are much better to recognize a face than a chair, for example.
Right.
So we try to really understand and dig into these unique mechanisms which allow us such an expert face perception. And then again, at a philosophy lesson, I met somebody whose name is Uri Hasson. He's a good friend, and today he's a professor of neuroscience in Princeton University. But he came from Rafi Malach's lab at Weizmann Institute, at which they also studied face perception, but using fMRI, using brain recording, while at Shlomo's lab, we did it using EEG, a different methodology.
Okay.
And I said, let's organize a seminar together. And we did that, like a meeting of two groups. We combined forces and discussed all the findings from the two labs. It was fascinating. And I fell in love with brain science, fMRI. So I studied my PhD in a combination of Hebrew University and Weizmann Institute. And also Professor Rafi Malach was also my supervisor. And during my PhD, I abandoned the face questions totally. And somehow I was drifted to investigate a very fascinating network, which is today called a default mode network. And it's a network which allows like self-integration and narrative understanding, the large network of holding and creating meaning in the brain. So it wasn't known then. We didn't know what this network does. We just identified it, and it was a story in itself. And doing this, we developed tools in which we started to define brain networks as brain regions which are synchronized with each other in their activity. So you can see what is a brain network. Brain network is like a bunch of regions in all kinds of anatomical locations. They are not directly connected, or not necessarily, But then when you look at the activity is synchronized. Although it can be in different hemispheres, one in the front, one in the back. But when the regions become synchronized in the activity, you say, this is a brain network, and probably these regions are synchronized because they do the same thing. They have a similar function.
I'm envisioning like an orchestra and
Exactly.
like different instruments playing at the same time, and everything is in tune.
Absolutely, that's the right metaphor. Just no conductor.
Right.
So that was my PhD, studying a large-scale mysterious brain network, which we didn't know its function. What is it doing? Today, we are much more progressed with understanding its function and nature, but not yet then. And then when I joined IDC, the psychology department, what happened is that at IDC, the psychology department is very, very social. A lot of excellent, amazing social researchers, which is a field that I didn't know before. I mean, I had no expertise in it. I didn't know that. I knew it exists, but I didn't know the kind of question that they asked, or the models, or the theories. And I started talking to people and developing interesting conversation in the kitchen, in the corridor. And also my scientific collaborator, Navalevi Ben-Nun, she was very interested in developmental questions, of interaction, how people interact, what is the optimal interaction. And out of this very rich, contextual, intellectual conversations, an idea arose of, wait, so during my PhD, I studied synchrony between brain regions, and we also developed really unique techniques to identify the synchrony and quantify the synchrony. But what about two people? Can we say that two people can be synchronized with each other, maybe spontaneously, without any instruction? And it was a mind-blowing idea. No evidence for it existed yet. It was a long time ago, at the beginning of my way at IDC. So I shared this idea with Mario Mikolincer, who was our dean. One of the people who really contributed a lot to this to my understanding of social processes and social psychology. And he said, yes, this is mimicry. We all know about it. And I'm like, mimicry? I never even heard this term. And then I discovered, the psychologists discovered a long time ago, that we mimic each other automatically. So when somebody smiles, I also smile. And then first I started noticing how we indeed mimic each other, which I didn't notice before I knew this, before I had this conversation with Mario. And then I thought, yet mimicry is not synchrony. And the question is what happens inside the body, what happens at the physiological level. And that's the story of how I became a synchrony researcher, because then we did our first experiments with two people who co-viewed a movie together, and we started to discover the conditions for synchrony and the function of synchrony, what is it good for, and when it happens and when it doesn't happen, and building some kind of initial models of it. The world kind of joined into it, because now it's one of the most popular and fastly developing fields in social neuroscience. It is beyond any doubt now these days the understanding that, yes, this is one of the basic interpersonal processes. We do tend to synchronize with each other. And in the most simple way, synchrony is communication. And we constantly communicate with the world, with each other, and synchrony is one of the ways to do it efficiently.
I think that the moment you find something happening on two levels of analysis, right? In the sense that we see mimicry happening in the behavioral level, but once we see it also on the brain level, on the physiological level, it lends so much more weight to that theory, and we can really trust that what we're seeing is a true phenomenon. So I think this research is amazing, and it's no wonder that social neuroscience has been taking off.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of just to give a little bit of context on the behavioral level of what kind of things do we mimic? What actually syncs up between two people?
Mm-hmm. So I think pretty much everything. And a useful distinction would be to think about it as an output system and input system. So all the physiology, the hormonal level, the cardiovascular level, the physiological level, the autonomic level, the brain level, it happens inside. And then we have a lot of output systems. It's like our motor activity and facial responses. Everything that goes outside towards the external world is an output behavior. And I think we have evidence that pretty much everything that we output to other people can be picked up and mimicked and become synchronized, become a channel for synchrony between people.
So body language, posture, like hand gestures,
accent, tempo of loudness of speech, and
tone of voice,
tone
and the
of
tempo,
voice.
and also emotions in a sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And how would you explain that in the sense that on the one hand we have facial expressions that can sync up, but how do emotions
become synced?
Yeah.
So first, they don't always become synced, right? So you can easily imagine a situation in which one person is, let's say, aggressive, so he's been angry, and another person is frightened. But even when you think about an angry and a frightened person, you think about high sympathetic tone. They're both physiologically aroused. They have negative valence, okay? So you can pick up two organisms which bind together in very activated negativity. So at that level, they are synchronized.
Right. It's manifesting in subtly different ways, but there is a synchronization in the sympathetic.
There is some level at which they are very much synced. Yeah.
Amazing. So when you guys study interpersonal synchrony, what kind of physiological markers are you using? What are you looking at?
Yeah. So again, pretty much everything. Okay. But we started with autonomic activity, which is, for example, heart rate. And it's quite amazing. You know, heart rate became one of my favorite markers for synchrony because it robustly shows the phenomena, and heart rate is something very easily recognized. I mean, physiological signals are noisy, especially if you record them from, fully behaving people who talk to each other. You have a lot of artifacts and some noise can come in. But with the heart rate, you have this very specific marker, and you know to identify your biological signal, which is super important with biological signals, not to confuse between the ratio between signal to noise. And
right.
So heart rate is a clean physiological signal. And then really, heart is not there for communication or emotions. It is there to support our life, right? This is its main function. My heart beats for a very good reason. And when it stops beating, that's it, right? It's not that I become unemotional, I just become non-existent. And then to identify these markers of synchrony in the heartbeats of people, it was really remarkable, and it's quite reliable. We saw it in many experiments across different populations. So heart rate.
And does only heart rate synchronize, or does the rhythm also synchronize? If you catch my drift, like, is it just the speed, or is it?
It is.
It is the speed?
It is the speed.
Not the rhythm?
It's the dynamics.
Okay.
So you can be like an 80 BPM person, I can be a 50 BPM person, but when your heart speeds up, my heart speeds up as well. It can be at different basal levels, but the dynamics is shared.
But the dynamics,
exactly. We move together in this space of cardiovascular activity. We also recorded galvanic skin response, which is how do you say light detection?
Yeah. Polygraph.
Exactly, from the polygraph. And this is a pure sympathetic marker. Sympathetic means like activation, arousal, preparedness for action. We see it also in respiration. And then in the last years, we started recording facial expressions, but not expressions per se, but the activity itself of facial muscles.
Right, like you guys hook up certain things to the cheeks, electrodes.
Yeah, and then we measure the tension in different muscles in the face. And this was mind-blowing because in contrast to physiological activity, which we said is not there mainly for communication. It is certainly involved in communication and emotional transmissions, but it's not its main function. But for facial expression, it was like you didn't need any statistics. You just could see it with your bare eyes when you looked at the signals that people become robustly synchronized in their facial expressions. And this was without looking at each other. So
wow. Okay. So yeah, could you give us some examples of how you guys conducted these experiments? Because a lot of the synchronization doesn't even happen in face-to-face interaction, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we started with non-direct interaction because so it was really fascinating actually to design these paradigms because on the one hand, you really want to preserve natural, spontaneous social behavior. On the other hand, you cannot allow all the variability between people. So let's say two strangers come into the lab and they do what? And we want to record synchrony. And what do they do? Okay, let them talk. But some people just click, and they have really lovely conversation and even go to some interesting stuff and intimate stuff and exposure. And another two people do not. And then they barely exchange words with each other. And then you have this huge variability. And then you don't know what is the meaning of the synchrony that you recorded or found. Because on psychological level, and even on the motor level, the amount of words they emitted, there were such huge differences. So what we did is we developed a co-viewing paradigm. We then discovered that actually it existed before, and there were some studies with this paradigm before, but without physiological aspects. And in this paradigm, people sit near each other and co-view a movie. And the task is to view the movie. They're explicitly asked not to communicate with each other. And if they do, then we just don't treat the data because, again, all this variability comes in. It was, by the way, really fascinating to see that people just couldn't refrain from talking. It was so hard for them.
I'm sure it's very awkward to come into a lab and there's another person and you're almost like compulsively you want to.
Absolutely. But it is, but it also reveals this huge motivation to connect. It was fascinating to see that. I mean, two students came to fulfill their credits for a course. They obliged to do this experiment. Yeah, so many of them treat it as something very super technical and just let me finish with it and go on with my day. You probably know it from your students' day. And then they sit near each other and within seconds, they start communicating. And then you need to remind them, please do not communicate. This is an experiment which goes on in silence. And sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't.
I think that just goes to show how social we are and how just the mere presence of another person can have such an impact, and to tie that back into Corona days and Zoom.
Absolutely.
Right? The fact that you don't have another human in the room. There's so much that you're missing.
Yeah.
That's under the radar, right? All of this synchrony and this feeling of connectedness that doesn't even need to happen on the level of words.
Yeah. But, it's interesting to understand what the boundaries of this. Can't we be synchronized virtually? And
have you guys tried that?
We do that this year, but I don't know the results yet. So.
No, that would
super
be
important.
Super important to understand really what the boundaries are.
Absolutely,
and what can we get from Zoom and what What are we missing?
Yeah. My feeling is that you can be absolutely synchronized over
Really?
Zoom. Yeah, because I could feel my accommodation to this virtual space. At first, it was like, what? How am I going to teach over Zoom? And the connection with the students and the feeling. I suddenly understood how much I pick up from the audience, from all these subtle cues, attentive, non-attentive, and how I actively work with these cues. But then we all accommodated and developed different forms of synchrony and communication. And
right. No, I think there was definitely an adaptation. I just I was very surprised when we went back to sort of normal life now and started meeting more face to face. I was surprised by how much the interaction, how much was added to the interactions.
Yeah.
Right, because still there's something in the physical space that I felt was very
absolutely
right. Yeah. But we obviously have been able to synchronize over Zoom and to make the best of it.
Yeah. Okay, back to the experiment.
Yes.
So two people sitting near each other and watching a movie, not communicating, and then what we found, and the movies were emotional movies because we wanted to kind of catalyzer for emotional behaviors to come out. And what we found is that people who watched the movie together were more synchronized than people who watched the same movie but not together.
Okay.
In different diets.
Okay. So it's not just the movie that was creating.
Exactly. First, the movie obviously synchronized between people. And this is also something important to understand because we also synchronize with the world.
Right.
So if we are embedded in the same emotional environment, we are necessarily synchronized at a certain level. If we are exposed to the same narrative, this narrative synchronizes between our brains and our bodies. But above and beyond the synchrony, there was something unique, like a unique marker for each and every couple, and the couple members, I mean in terms of experiment, these were strangers to each other. So they were different from other couples. They were more synchronized with each other than with all the other participants who viewed exactly the same movie, but not with them.
Amazing. And you guys also did certain experiments with actual couples, right? With people who were in intimate relationships. What did you find in these kinds of experiments?
Different stuff. And it's also something important to understand about synchrony. Synchrony is not good or bad. It's synchrony. And what synchrony creates is kind of binding, for example, in emotional context, and this is the context of which I'm most knowledgeable because that's what we study. So it binds people into a similar emotional experience.
Okay.
Sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it's really a bad thing.
Right. So two people can also bring each other down in a sense, and then they can
Absolutely.
sync around a negativity.
I think about a conflict. If you sync with your partner, for example, in the context of a conflict, it's a very bad road because then nobody regulates and you will just go up, and
right. Okay.
Nobody will break this vicious circle.
Right. It's spirals, spirals out of control. Okay. And so there was one thing that I wanted to ask about what you guys have found in terms of individual differences of how well people synchronize. And you guys have used all sorts of markers and to investigate this. But what have you found in terms of these individual differences and how certain people are able to synchronize really well with their environment and other people not so much?
So I think first individual differences exist, of course. And these individual differences can exist at the level of individual. That's the kind of person I am. And they can also exist in terms of context. Like that what happens to me today or with this person or with that movie or with this situation. So I can be very different in different situations and in different contexts. And this is something very important to understand about our brain, is that it is highly contextual. So even when we discover biological principles, it doesn't mean determinism. It doesn't mean that the behavior is fixed. It will change according to the context. And context is first and for all about cues. You recognize context by cues. And this recognition of cues is super important to synchrony. So, for example, these two people who sat near each other and co-viewed the movie and were still synchronized with each other, although they didn't communicate or didn't turn to each other. What happened? How did they become synchronized? And we think that they became synchronized because they picked up, our perceptual system picks up subtle cues from another person and does it constantly, even when we are not aware of this process of these cues. It picks up these cues and integrates it into its own experience or response. And that's how we become synchronized. And we even tested this model because we did another experiment in which, again, two people were sitting and co-viewing a movie, but in one condition, we put like a non-transparent divider between them. So we stopped the transmission of the cues. So they were still together, they were still co-viewing a movie, but there was like a blockade between them. They couldn't communicate also visually, and then it significantly reduced the synchrony.
Okay, so there is something in the perceptual system that's picking up these subtle cues, and we're unconscious of it happening, but this input that we're getting from the other person.
Exactly. And think how reasonable it is. I mean, you are in a certain space, in proximity to another person. You want to know whether to trust this person or not to trust this person, how exactly to build your behavior with this person. This is very important, essential even. And that's why when we are in an elevator with somebody, it's kind of an awkward situation, right? You're close with somebody and you cannot ignore his or her presence because your system really strives to identify what's going on with this person. And this mechanisms also support synchrony because you pick up all these subtle cues and then you kind of flow with these cues and accommodate to each other and develop a certain common vibe or common tempo or which builds up synchrony, unless there are good reasons to not to do it.
Okay, and in what situation would there be good reasons not to synchronize?
For example, if you're in a competitive context.
Okay.
Or if it's somebody, if there is power involved, somebody is more powerful than the other, or competition of resources, for sure. This is like the first breaker of synchrony. Somebody who's been unfair to you before.
Interesting. Okay. So you wouldn't want to become synchronized. Although I'm picturing like in a competitive situation, maybe there would be a synchrony in the autonomic level, right, of arousal.
Well, it depends on the context, actually, very much. Again, it depends on which situation.
What situation we're looking at, of course. There was a particular study between mothers and daughters that you guys found, right, and that you saw that there was different cardiac vagal regulation, right, and how that affected the positive emotions that were transmitted between the mother and the daughter.
Right. The codependency of the autonomic system and the regulatory effort. Yeah, now I understand what RSA study you're talking about. Okay. Because there's a lot of RSA studies.
I see.
So just to be clear about the terms, RSA is a respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And it's actually a fascinating physiological phenomena. And what it means is it's also called heart rate variability. So our heart rate is not constant. It only constants when we reach the finish line.
Yeah.
So it changes a little bit from bit to bit. The heart rate changes. And the more it changes, the more it is variable, the better for you. So you have better regulatory powers. It is uniquely and specially connected to regulatory abilities, to also to your social capacities, to your ability to meet stress in a more positive way and more resilient way. So to have a variable heart rate is a super good thing for you. And what research found is that when we engage in positive social situation, our heart rate variability increases. So the more it increases, the more variable our heart rate becomes. And variable means flexible. I think that's the idea.
Right. Able to change.
Exactly. So the more variable our heart rate becomes in a social context, the more the interaction is positive and fluent and nice and and harmonious. It's linked with positive social capacities, this heart rate variability. So what we found in this research is that when mothers and daughters did a collaborative task together, they linked in their heart rate variability. So mothers and daughters were synchronized in the degree of their heart rate variability. And the higher levels of heart rate variability and this linkage were actually linked with more positive emotional experience and regulatory experience from this interaction.
Amazing.
But what we didn't know in this study, that the one thing that I'm always, when you're doing a research, after you finish it and you look at the results, you kind of say, oh my God, how could I not measure this thing? So we always miss something. And it's always a crucial part to your story, which you didn't think about recording. And it's actually a torture to develop an experimental design, because you need to give up so many parts, because you can't do very long experiments, right? You need to limit yourself to a very final set of variables. And then you give up a lot of pieces of a puzzle, and you know for sure that you will be, for one of them, you will be very, very sorry at the end. So this time, what we couldn't identify is whether actually these mothers and daughters were similar to each other in their RSA, not only during this particular interaction, which went, for example, good for this particular couple, but they actually arrived similar because certain mothers promote certain physiological qualities in their children. So we couldn't understand if it's a trait, or if it's a state. If this particular mother and daughter had a very successful and positive interaction, or if this particular mother and daughter usually have positive and successful interaction, because that's the way this mother communicates with her daughter. And but
for the next experiment.
Exactly. Yeah.
A bit of a different gear. You teach a course called The Dark Side of Interpersonal Synchrony. And I wanted us to get into that because, as we've been talking, I mean, we mentioned it a little bit with two people who are synchronizing over negativity or over conflict. But I wanted to hear from you, what do you think are the dark sides of interpersonal synchrony? What can manifest that is negative here?
So imagine an army march, or imagine a certain demonstration, political demonstration, or imagine
a mob.
Exactly, yeah. And these are people who act the same, who look the same. With the army march, it's in particularly pronounced, right? They act the same, they move the same, they are dressed the same. It's all happening according to a certain rhythm, because it's a kind of there is always a kind of a music behind. These are highly synchronized individuals who are not individuals anymore. They become a group. And that's what synchrony is for.
Right. And groups are able to do a lot more damage than an individual would do to you.
So groups, first and for all, what's important about group is that they care about the group more than they care about individuals.
Mm-hmm.
The members of a group, that becomes more important. And I think this is the function also of group synchrony, right? For individuals to be able to leave their own ego and their own self behind and to merge into an ego and the self of this group.
And that there is something that's really, really addictive about that, right? That's why we go to a concert, right? We want to forget ourselves and we want to be connected with everyone. Or like a soccer game. But, in a soccer game, you see a lot of conflict as well because of this synchronization.
Of the group members, right? And then you have this context of competing with another group, which is a classic, right? Soccer game is a classic of intergroup conflict. Absolutely. With these uniforms and things to chant and chanting. And yes, you are absolutely right that we love it. And the experience of being synchronized with somebody immediately gives us this sense of connection. And it's a very positive sense. The experience itself is pleasurable.
Right. I think, as you were speaking, something came to mind in the sense of groupthink, right? That when we are able to leave our own individual ego or our own capacity for sense making, and we kind of outsource our sense making to the group, whatever everyone else is agreeing with, right? This conformity, and that might serve us in certain situations, but it might also lead to a society that doesn't have individuals who are thinking for themselves.
So
it's a deep topic here.
The thing is that you're absolutely right. And we could now flow with this picture of the world. But the truth is that if you ask me, then individuals never think for themselves to begin with.
Okay, why? Why is that?
Give me one opinion that you have about this world, which is yours. You didn't pick it up from
no, of
other
course
individuals.
We're products of the way we grow up, and we're products of the information that we take in, right? The books that we read, the podcasts that we listen to, whatever.
The Facebook
accounts that we scroll through.
The news, the TV, the culture,
But we are, I think, our own unique amalgam of all of these things together, plus and there's that meeting place of all of these external influences with our temperament and with our dispositions that we're born with. So there is a social part to the self. I completely agree that the self is, we don't live on an island, and you can't look at the individual in a vacuum. There is the individual and the collective, and they're constantly in dialogue. And I think on each one of those spectrums, you have the positive and the negative. You have the positive side of individuality and the negative side, and also of the collective. There's a lot of good things that come from community and from tribe, but there's also the dark side here.
Yeah. So the change, at least that I've undergone in my development of how I see the world and society and the individuals within the societies, is that beyond the good things that come from the collective, it's really important to understand how the collective is essential. It's not like good to have. It's something you can't live without. It's like an oxygen. It's not like a nice car.
Absolutely. And I think that, on an evolutionary level, we are so social exactly because the collective for humans is not optional.
It's not an option.
Right. We've evolved not as humans, but as humanity.
And as groups, and it's not only us, it's actually, you can say it about all the mammals. And this is the function of our brain. The function of our brain is not to survive. the function of our brain is to communicate with others, because this is how we survive. And that's why all these remarkable mechanisms that we talked about, mechanisms which push us into synchrony with others, they're hardcore biological mechanisms and built in when we come with them to this world from day minus when we are not even born.
No, absolutely. So from that, that premise of the collective is 100% essential, we still see these negative manifestations of interpersonal synchrony, right? We see these intergroup conflicts, and
I'm not sure they're negative.
But you teach a whole course on the dark side.
That's why I call they are negative in the eyes of Western person. Okay, because we are raised with a certain philosophy that we are independent, that we have our own ideas, that conformity is a bad thing. Okay, this, I think everybody, you wouldn't tell somebody, wow, you're such a conformist, right? That would mean, of course. But that's the most reasonable. Conform is our nature. That's how we live. Of course, we are conformist. Yes, we live with others and we develop together a common reality and we conform to this reality. It's not a bad thing. Bad thing can happen from it. And again, bad in terms of pain of other people, right? But even when you look at intergroup conflicts, that's very natural. It's when different groups fight for resources. A lot of bad things happen, but in the context...
But it's not that the group essentially is negative, of course.
Yeah, and the conflict and intergroup conflicts are like a part of being a group. If you are a member of a group, if you belong to a group, then it certainly strengthens the group boundaries and the idea of this is my group, this is not my group.
Right.
And,
the moment you have an in-group, the moment you have a sense of belonging to a certain tribe, you automatically create an out-group.
Exactly.
Right, and there's an us and them dynamic, and I wanted to hit upon this this topic of oxytocin, right, being a hormone that helps bind people together. We always think of it as
love hormone.
Exactly, what bonds a mother to her child, or two people who are in love. It's the love hormone, but we also see it playing a significant part in, for instance, coordinated intergroup conflict, right? Like this sense of camaraderie that that soldiers will feel with each other, or the sense of camaraderie that soccer soccer fans feel for their group members against another. And this, I guess that would be the dark side here, that whenever you have an attachment, whenever you have a bond to one person, there's all the rest of the people that you would be willing to protect them from, right? I always imagine like a mother lioness, right? Like oxytocin is binding her to her cub, but anyone comes near and she's willing to rip them to shreds.
Exactly. So yeah, oxytocin being a love hormone is like totally fake news, and science tends to produce many fake news recently. It's a very bad thing. I mean, I hope that complexity will find its way back to the media and to the science media in particularly. So oxytocin is not a love hormone, and it's not a connection hormone. Actually, the best model which exists today is that what oxytocin does is that it increases our sensitivity to social cues.
Okay.
So you remember that we talked about the importance of social cues when we talked about synchrony, and that actually synchrony is building upon noticing all these emotional social cues which arrive from another person or from the context. For example, this person being an in-group or an out-group, a competitor or collaborator. All this is built upon all kinds of social cues, verbal and non-verbal. And oxytocin makes you more sensitive to these social cues. So if you imagine an intergroup situation or context, Oxytocin will make you more vigilant, for example, and more, tensed when you will detect cues that this other person is not from your group. It will cause you to imagine all kinds of negative scripts and maybe be avoidant or be more aggressive because this belonging to different group will suddenly be more important, more salient for your perceptual systems. You will not be able to discard it.
Right. I think it goes back to this idea of a sense of belonging is so important to us as humans because we're so social and because we've evolved in groups. And I think understanding that that's the underlying motivation for a lot of things can help us untangle the intergroup conflicts that we see today, because we do live in a slightly more civilized world, and we hope to make some sort of progress. And I think a lot of times, instead of demonizing certain behaviors, and I think it's a lot more useful to understand the biological substrates that drive us, right? The instincts. For instance, Jane Goodall, one of the things she observed is that in chimpanzees, every day a pack of the males and sometimes a female would join in. They would do these boundary patrols around their territory. And if they saw a chimpanzee that wasn't from their tribe, they would rip him to shreds.
Wow.
Right. So, and those are our ancestors in a certain regard. Right. So we've evolved a long ways from there. We can live in cities like New York City where people are from all over the world, and there's so much difference, so much diversity, but understanding the biological instincts that kind of pull us back, I think can help us. The more we understand, the more we can move forward.
So I think this is a very important and beautiful vision of the picture, that intergroup aggressiveness is rooted in group connectedness and the sense of belonging. And I would add that this can actually help us to devise philosophy, and approach to these conflictual situations, which is based on understanding these principles. So, for example, instead of leaving behind our identities, social identities, which we just cannot do, especially not in Israel. I mean, Israel is just, the heart of everything. We can create novel identities, which can encapsulate all kind of different identities and be more complex than what we are used to, but it is an identity, yes?
Right, and they still provide that belonging.
Exactly, because this is a need which needs to be satisfied.
Right, and if it's not satisfied, it will be satisfied in a less pure ways.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Okay, so circling back a bit, I wanted to ask, of your research, what would you most want people to take away from what you found around interpersonal synchrony?
So I think that it's really important to understand this very basic tendency of us to connect and to synchronize with others. And synchrony means connection automatically. And for me, it was very important to recognize it, even in myself. And I started to see world differently when I saw the results of our experiments, because it's one thing to think about it theoretically, philosophically, or to talk about it at a dinner conversation. And it's another thing to see two strangers come into a lab, sit near each other, and synchronize in their facial muscles immediately, without and in a very robust way. So it's a powerful drive, and it's important to acknowledge it, to examine if this drive is satisfied in your life, and if we are giving enough conscious resources to the social parts of our life, to these parts which need to feel connected and secured by this connection, and loving and love. And if we are taking care of other people, because this taking care is a powerful physiological mechanism which contributes enormously to our well-being, it's important to take care. We mammals need to take care of others. This is part of our definition as a mammal. And seeing human beings as social animals, I think this is maybe the message, right? That the strong message that comes from social neuroscience now. It's been known to social psychologists for ages, yeah, but they've been at war for decades. Is it self or is it other? Yeah,
Right.
who came first? And today the answer is very clear. The we came first before the I. The I developed from the we, and I think it's super. It has a great potential to acknowledge this and to understand how this we force plays out in your own life.
Absolutely. I think individualism today in Western culture, it brought about a lot of positive things, but also I think we do forget the social element. We do forget how important the tribe is for us and how important this sense of we and community is. And I think remembering that gives a real balance to your life.
Yeah.
So for my last question, the podcast is called The Bigger Picture. And what that means is basically zooming out and taking a wider view of the world, of your life, of your work, and finding the deeper meaning in things and seeing what your hopes are for your work and what kind of impact you want it to have. How you envision your life and what the bigger picture of your life and your work is. So, big question.
Big question. Surprise question. Even beyond all the big stuff that I already said. So, in some interesting and non-linear way, thinking about the deeper meaning of my life and the work that I do and what I would like to contribute also to others and the world, I'm coming back to the self. And because I think that we really live in a very exciting times when we have significant progress in understanding how our brain and our consciousness builds reality. And I think that it's very important for people who are not brain students or psychology students, but just people who strive to understand themselves. It's very important, I think, today to educate yourself with all these new models that come from neuroscience, because it has substantial keys to understanding these mysteries, how this reality is created in according to your past, in according to the meaning that you build, in according to your expectations, and how the conditioning plays in all this, and how the reality is really very relative and subjective and can be changed, very easily, but needs very hard work every day for substantial changes, but still the potential is there. And I think that if people understand how that the reality is constructed and not given to us, we do not respond to reality, but we construct it, then all these social issues and the hard questions that you raised, the interpersonal conflict, and also the personal suffering can be really contributed by this knowledge.
Amazing. I think that touches upon a really important point of how reality is constructed, right? I think that's a really important takeaway. And understanding, what part we can play in that, and I think that gives us a lot more control over our life, in a sense, right? And when we know that we can construct our own reality, that gives us a sense of freedom, almost, and an ability to change things.
Choice.
Exactly. Wonderful, Yulia. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today.
I enjoyed it very much as well. Thank you, Ronnie.
Into the bigger picture. I hope you found this conversation interesting. You can find us on all podcasting platforms, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to hit subscribe to stay up to date with the latest episodes. My name is Roni Firon. This is The Bigger Picture, and thank you for listening. Till next time.